Good evening, friends. I'm Mr. Narratory. If you're here, it means the day is done and the quiet has finally arrived. Tell me, what time is it where you are right now? And what's your favorite way to end the day? If these stories bring you peace, consider subscribing, liking, or sharing them with someone who needs a little calm. Now, let's begin. The first time I stepped through the old stone arch and into the garden, the moon was only a sliver, and the air smelled faintly of rosemary and something sweeter I couldn't name. There was no gate, no latch, no marker to suggest it had been built by anyone in particular. It simply stood at the back of a narrow courtyard, behind a low building with shuttered windows and ivy climbing in long vertical ropes. The arch had a kind of memory to it, the way well-worn gloves seem to remember the shape of your fingers even after years apart. It wasn't hidden. Nothing in that part of the town ever was. But people didn't seem to pass that way often, and if they did, they didn't linger. I had found it after supper, when the air had cooled and the day's last breeze carried the scent of turned earth and resting stone. What surprised me most was how open the garden felt, not vast, not grand, but wide in its welcome. The stone path curved gently through the center, flanked on either side by beds of plants I couldn't name, soft-leaved and heavy with moisture. Some curled upward toward the dark sky, their blooms unfolding slowly in pale shades of silver and violet. Others pulsed with low color, a dusky glow barely brighter than the starlight. The whole place breathed like something alive, but unbothered, untroubled, unconcerned by time. There were no lanterns, but the garden glowed faintly, steadily with the same light that comes from deep snow or the inside of a seashell. I walked slowly, listening not for sounds, but for silence, and found that even the hush here had texture. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the presence of growing things, with the sound of dew gathering, of vines shifting gently in their sleep. I didn't know who had built it, or who tended it now, but nothing was overgrown. Every plant leaned exactly where it was meant to lean. Every path bent as if in conversation with the one before it. There were benches, low and old, built from stone that had been rubbed smooth along the edges. I found one beneath the arch of a willow tree that hung so low its branches brushed the tops of my shoes, and I sat there, breathing with the garden. The longer I stayed, the more it revealed, not loudly, not quickly, but with the kind of quiet trust that comes only when you've forgotten to measure time. The blooms began to open further, tall, delicate stalks, with petals like folded paper slowly spread into wide, sleeping faces, catching the moonlight in their shallow cups. Some quivered without wind, as if shifting in response to the rhythm of thought. Others uncurled from tight spirals of bud into long, trailing vines that wrapped softly around trellises that hadn't been there when I arrived. I leaned back on the bench and watched the way the plants made space for each other, how nothing rushed, how nothing claimed more than it needed. Even the moss, rich and green in the gaps between the stones, grew in gentle patterns, spirals and arcs that felt not planted but understood. I stayed until the sky had grown deep blue, almost black, and the scent of the garden had turned darker, too less sweet, more rooted. Somewhere behind the far hedge, a bell rang once low, distant, not to summon, only to mark something quietly beginning or quietly ending. I left the same way I came, back through the arch, but the street beyond felt softer now, as if the garden had taught it how to rest. I returned the next evening just after twilight, when the last trace of orange had pulled itself down beneath the rooftops and the sky had settled into its soft, predictable blue. The stone arch hadn't changed, though a few new petals had fallen near its base, delicate and curled, like tiny pieces of parchment folded by the breeze. I stepped over them and into the garden again without hesitation, and this time the scent was different, heavier with jasmine maybe, or something like it, something old and dusk sweet. The air was thicker, but not humid, as if time had begun to slow down inside the hedges and hadn't yet decided where to stop. The path beneath my feet was warm still from the day, holding the sun like a memory, and I followed it with a kind of careful reverence. The vines that had gently wrapped the trellises the night before were now blooming, hundreds of star-shaped flowers opening one by one in a rhythm I couldn't see, but could sense like breathing or tides. I paused at the first turn, where the stone path curved beside a small basin I hadn't noticed before. It was set low to the ground, rimmed in smooth rock, and filled with perfectly clear water, unmoving. Floating on the surface were 5 tiny blossoms, so pale they were almost translucent. They didn't drift. They just rested there, each one perfectly still, their petals open to the sky. I crouched beside them, not touching, and listened. Not for words, but for presence. The sound was not silence, exactly. It was a soft thrum, like the hum of distant crickets, or wind through deep grass, or perhaps even the sound of growing itself. I couldn't be sure. I stayed low to the ground until my knees ached, and then rose slowly, brushing my fingers against the tall grasses that flanked the next path. They shifted under my touch, not away from it, but toward the way a cat leans into a hand. I continued past a patch of low blue flowers that swayed even without breeze, and a series of lantern-like bulbs that pulsed gently from within, not flickering, but breathing, slow, dim, bright, dim again. In one corner of the garden, beneath the bowed branches of what looked like a blackthorn tree, stood a low table with 2 stools. There was no sign of recent use. No cups, no plates, no crumbs or napkins. And yet the table felt warm, as though someone had sat there only minutes before. A single flower, large, open, almost heart-shaped, lay in the center of the table, its petals edged in a faint silver glow. I didn't sit, I only watched. Across the garden, I could hear water now, not rushing, not trickling, but dripping a steady rhythm that seemed to echo from somewhere deeper in, beyond the reach of light. The moss between the stones had shifted color since the night before, now deeper green, almost velvet. I passed a cluster of plants with tall stalks and small purple blossoms that shimmered in the dark like the skin of plums. Bees moved slowly among them, though not like bees I'd seen before. They were slower, heavier, content to hover without landing, trailing faint light like sparks from a match. I paused again at the willow, the same one I had sat beneath before. Its branches moved slightly, though the air was still. Beneath it, the bench remained, but beside it now was a small stone bowl filled with water, and beside the bowl a folded scrap of linen damp at the edges, as if someone had used it and set it aside with care. I sat. The rainless hush of the garden wrapped itself around me, and the longer I stayed, the more it felt as though the garden didn't grow in response to time, but in response to presence. As though the act of sitting, breathing, noticing was what allowed the vines to open, the roots to stretch, the petals to shine. I leaned back, let my shoulders drop, and the sky above, dark now but full of kind stars, looked down without judgment. Somewhere far off, I thought I heard wind chimes, but they didn't ring. They only swayed, and beneath them, I imagined a path I hadn't walked yet, curving into another corner of this place where no one rushed and nothing slept it, simply rested, blooming gently in the soft hush of forever evening. The third evening, I brought nothing with minnow book, no journal, not even the usual scarf tucked into my coat pocket. It felt right to come to the garden with empty hands. The path leading to the stone arch seemed softer underfoot, as though the ground itself had grown more forgiving. The ivy clinging to the arch had bloomed overnight, pale gold blossoms trailing down like small bells, unmoving even as I passed beneath them. The moment I stepped into the garden, I felt it again, that shift in the air, not colder or warmer, but deeper, like entering a room where someone has just finished speaking and their words still linger, suspended. The rain-slick shine of the path from the night before had faded to a matte softness, and the moss between the stones was now dotted with the tiniest mushrooms, so pale and round they looked like pinched stars. I didn't follow the main path this time. Instead, I took a narrow trail that had seemed too shy to walk before, its entrance partially hidden by a pair of broad-leafed ferns. As I stepped between them, their fronds brushed against my arm's knot like plants, but like drapery, something welcoming and meant to be moved aside. The path curved tightly and led into a part of the garden I hadn't seen, where the canopy grew thicker and the moonlight scattered in dappled, shifting light. It smelled richer here of soil and mint, and faintly of lemon balm crushed underfoot. The plants were lower, closer to the ground, with wide leaves that held dew long after the rain had stopped. I passed under an archway of living branches and entered a hollow encircled by shrubs shaped like old stone walls. In the center stood a small fountain, if it could be called that. No water flowed from it, but the stone was slick with moisture, and from its basin rose long, hair-thin stalks tipped with glowing seeds, like stars that had landed gently and chosen not to leave. I sat on a low stone nearby, more moss than rock, and listened. And slowly, the garden began to move not with sound, but with shape. Vines shifted to lean closer. Petals turned inward, then outward again. Leaves tilted slightly, catching drops of light that filtered through the trees above. I closed my eyes for a moment, just to rest them. And when I opened them, the path I'd taken had blurred behind a cluster of tall grasses, now swaying gently as though they'd always grown there. I felt no alarm. The garden does not lose you. It simply holds you a while longer when it senses you are willing to stay. The longer I sat, the more I noticed things that hadn't been obvious at first. Small bowls carved into tree roots, filled with shells or feathers. Stones shaped into soft spirals, set into the soil. A worn notebook, coverless and half buried, its pages blank, but textured with lines pressed so faintly they might have been words erased by time. I didn't read it. I placed my hand on it, lightly, and let it rest. The leaves above me shifted, casting slow shadows across the clearing, and a breeze moved through, not cold, not sudden, just enough to stir something inside me. And then I heard it again, the bell, one soft note from somewhere beyond, lower than before, almost like it had come from underground. I stood, not quickly, and turned toward where the sound had come from, but the garden was already quiet again. I made no effort to follow it. I took the long way back. Or perhaps the garden chose it for me, through a tunnel of flowering trees whose petals glowed faintly blue, and under an arch of lantern-shaped blooms that pulsed once as I passed. The bench beneath the willow was empty when I arrived, but the stone bowl beside it now held a folded cloth, and on top of it a single white petal, curled inward like a listening ear. I sat again, just for a few breaths, and let the garden wrap around me. It made no demand. It offered nothing more than its rhythm, its light, its hush, and that, as always, was enough. That night, the clouds hung low over the rooftops, and the moon never showed herself. Yet when I stepped through the stone arch, the garden was still gently glowing, lit from within rather than above. It wasn't the sort of light that pushed back darkness. It was the kind that understood. It made room for it. Like a firefly, or the last glint on the rim of a teacup, the garden held its quiet luminescence without claiming the night. The ivy bells on the arch had closed now. Each one drooped in a perfect oval, their gold edges pale as straw. I passed beneath them and found the path already damp, though the air held no scent of rain. I paused at the first bend, where the shallow basin still held its floating blossoms. There were only 3 tonight, drifting lazily in slow circles, their petals broader, their color deeper as if they had soaked in some invisible dusk. The bench under the willow was still there, of course, but I didn't go to it. Instead, I followed the soft trail of moss leading away from the main path and toward a low rise in the ground that I hadn't noticed before. It was only a few steps high, but from its crest, the entire garden opened like a sigh. I could see every winding corridor, every bloom-laced trellis, every corner where light curled gently around the leaves. It felt not like looking at a place, but like reading a page someone had left open just for me. From that spot, I realized something else. The garden didn't grow in rows or rings. It grew in memory. There was a pattern, but not geometric. It was emotional. Soft clusters of stillness bloomed where stillness was needed. Paths didn't lead toward destinations. They coiled gently around ideas, around echoes, around forgotten things too kind to leave behind. As I stood there, a breeze moved through the tall flowering reeds just below the rise, and they whispered against each other like people in shared silence. I stepped down into their rustling company, brushing my fingertips along their cool stems. Beneath them, nestled in a shallow curve of soil, I found something waiting, a small object wrapped in oilcloth, tied with twine. It looked like it had been left there not just for someone, but for someone who would arrive slowly. I sat on the ground beside it and listened. The air was heavier Heralush, like linen hung to dry beside a river. When I opened the bundle, I found a smooth wooden token inside, carved with a spiral on one side and a leaf on the other. It had been handled many times. The wood was warm, even in the night. I held it for a long time and didn't speak, not even in my own thoughts. There are moments in this garden that ask for no interpretation. They only ask to be felt, like the way quiet feels heavier after music, or how a hand still remembers being held long after it's empty. I returned the token to its cloth, tied it again, and placed it carefully back in the soil. Not as I found it, but better. I rested it against a low root so it wouldn't sink out of sight. The wind moved once more through the reeds, slower now, thankful perhaps. When I found the path again, the moss beneath my steps had turned from green to a faint violet gray, and the glow of the flowers around me felt lower, closer to the earth, like night pulling a blanket gently over the roots. I passed the willow without stopping. I paused, instead, beside the trellis where the star-shaped flowers bloomed. They were larger tonight. One of them turned slightly, as I neared not from wind, but with the soft curiosity of something that recognizes a returning presence. I touched nothing. I walked slowly back toward the arch, where the ivy had begun to close further still, as if tucking in for a long, wordless evening. The garden, unchanged and always changing, said nothing. And in its silence, I heard more than words. The next evening, I arrived just before the light had finished leaving the sky, when color still clung gently to the undersides of clouds, and everything shimmered with that soft hour between remembering and forgetting. The town behind me felt quieter than usual, as though its sounds had pulled inward to rest. I passed under the arch without hesitation, noting that the ivy had turned again, now dusted with soft fuzz and capped by the gentlest purple buds curled inward like closed eyes. The moss path had darkened to deep green, still damp beneath my steps, but now soft as felt. I didn't follow any particular direction this time. The garden didn't ask me to. It seemed to unfold with me a little wider, a little warmer. I passed the hollow, where the fountain once shimmered with seed light gone now, or simply waiting and paused instead beside a tall stand of flowering stalks that had bent across the path as though bowing to the dusk. Each bloom was open and glowing faintly from within, casting a light not outward, but downward, pooling across the ground in long, drowsy ovals. The garden smelled different again, hints of crushed thyme, a wisp of chamomile, and something sharper I couldn't place, like citrus beneath earth. I reached out toward one of the blossoms and stopped just short of touching it. The petal quivered just once, and then tilted ever so slightly toward me, like a listener leaning in. I moved on without speaking. The breeze this evening felt different, too, not as cool, not as curious. It passed through the garden like a sigh after a kind word, soft and low, the kind that makes branches shift without rustling. As I rounded the corner of the low hedge lined with sleeping clover, I saw something new. A low table made of dark wood, not stone, placed beneath a canopy of broad leaves and lit by a series of glass jars that glowed with no visible flame. On the table sat 3 small bowls, one filled with pale pebbles, one with seeds, and the last with folded scraps of linen. There was no chair, no invitation, but the table felt waiting, not in urgency, just readiness. I knelt beside it and examined the bowls without touching. Each seed looked familiar but unnamed, the way a tune might sound when you know the feeling it gives, but not the melody. I lifted one pebble, smooth and warm, and placed it in the center of the table. Then I chose a seed at random and did the same. When I reached for a linen scrap, it fluttered slightly in my hand, not with wind, but with memory. I opened it and found a single stitched thread across the center. No letters, no symbol, just a curved line. I folded it again and placed it atop the others. As I stood, the leaves above me shimmered once, their edges trembling just enough to drop a light dusting of water down onto the table's surface. It soaked in silently, leaving no mark. I followed a winding path I didn't remember ever seeing before, deeper into a part of the garden that felt heavier with hush. The flowers here were smaller, paler, most of them closed but breathing. Some moved slightly as I passed, the way animals stir in sleep when they sense the world shifting. I found a new bench, this one lower, built into the curve of a low walland as I sat. I noticed a circle of petals had gathered at my feet, perfectly shaped, though no breeze had delivered them. The moon had risen now, but stayed low, almost bashful behind the trees. And still, the garden glowed, not bright, not strange, just enough to see by, and no more. I stayed until the light behind my eyes matched the dimness around me, until thought became stillness, and stillness became presence. When I rose to leave, the petals stayed behind. A few caught the folds of my coat, clung there softly, and I let them. Back at the arch, the ivy had closed completely. But as I stepped through, it parted once more, slow as breath, letting me go the same way it let the dark in. There was fog in the air when I returned, not thick enough to obscure the path, but enough to soften the distance between things to blur the edges of lamplight and tree trunks, to hush the sound of my own footsteps as I walked slowly toward the familiar archway. The ivy was still closed, curled in dense green spirals, but when I approached, it relaxed not in a showy gesture, but like the easing of a hand once held too tightly. The air on the other side was warmer than the night before and carried a new scent, a blend of pine and old stone, as if the garden had turned slightly in its rest and uncovered an older memory. The path beneath my feet was slightly different, again textured this time, with small stones pressed into the moss, forming patterns too gentle to be called deliberate. I followed the way they curved, leading me along a low wall lined with plants I hadn't seen before. Short, bristled stems tipped with soft red petals, each one barely open, as though caught mid-thought. As I passed, a few turned their heads slightly, not toward me, but toward the space I had just been, as if tracking the trace of presence, not the shape. I walked on without speaking. The fog above me glowed faintly with moonlight, turning the garden silver at its edges. Everything shimmered without sparkle, more glow than glint, more breath than light. I passed the old basin again, and this time there were no blossoms floating on its surface. Instead, the water held a perfect stillness that reflected nothing, no stars, no branches, not even my face as I leaned over it. The water didn't move when I touched it, but I felt something in the air change, a silence, deeper than quiet, a pause, like the moment between the inhale and exhale of an idea. I moved slowly away and found myself at the edge of a new clearing, gently sloped and surrounded by tall grass that shimmered like silk beneath the fog. At its center stood a tree I hadn't seen before, tall, spare, with branches like long fingers, each tipped with clusters of tiny pale blooms. The bark was smooth and ash-colored, and around its base the ground was bare, as if even the moss had chosen not to crowd it. I approached carefully, my steps falling softer now, and as I neared the tree, I noticed something wrapped around its trunk, a ribbon of deep green fabric, weathered but strong, knotted in a single loose loop. I didn't untie it. I didn't need to. Its presence was enough. I sat at the base of the tree and let my back rest against its side. The fog curled gently around me, warm at my collar and cool against my fingers. The garden didn't move. It waited. Or more accurately, it rested with me. The air thickened with thought, but not the kind that demands answers. These were the thoughts that float just beneath the surface of sleep. Memories without pictures, names without people, the warmth of something once held. The longer I stayed, the more the garden folded into itself like the slowing pulse of a tide. Petals folded. Leaves grew still. Even the usual shimmer along the stems had softened to a breath. Somewhere behind me, I heard the bell again, closer this time. One low tone, like the end of a sentence you never had to say aloud. I stood slowly, the fog still low against my legs, and walked back along the same path, though now the stones beneath me had rearranged into a soft spiral that led me again to the willow. The bench was gone. In its place, a woven mat, wide and low, with a folded blanket resting on its edge. I knelt there, brushed my hand across the fabric, and felt warmth, though no sun had touched it. I didn't sit. I bowed my head slightly, as one does at the end of a song, and let the moment pass through me. When I reached the arch again, the ivy didn't move. It was already open. The fog slipped out behind me, spilling gently back toward the street, and though the town beyond hadn't changed, I carried the hush of the garden in my chest, like a second rhythmo that moved slower than breath, but deeper than sound. The fog had lifted when I returned, but the garden felt no less wrapped in quiet. The air was clear, crisp at its edges, but soft through the center, like fabric laid flat after long rest. The ivy over the arch was still parted from the night before, though its blossoms had returned, their pale gold petals hanging lower now, weighted not by rain but by the soft pull of evening. I passed beneath them without touching. The garden greeted me not with change this time, but with a kind of steadiness, as though it had decided to remain just as I left it, a gesture of trust, maybe, or a quiet acknowledgement that some silences should linger a little longer before shifting. The moss along the path was brighter tonight, almost glowing at the tips, and small white flowers had begun blooming low to the ground, peeking out like thoughts at the edge of dreaming. I followed the familiar curves past the still basin, past the tree with the ribbon around its trunk, and deeper into the far side of the garden where the air seemed warmer, as if the earth had been holding on to its breath just below the surface. The clearing I found was simple, a flat space ringed by waste, high shrubs that bloomed with wide pale petals, each one pulsing faintly from within. At the center, a single cushion rested, no mat, no bench, just fabric, thick and woven, holding the shape of someone who had sat and stayed. I approached slowly, letting the hush fold itself tighter with each step. The garden no longer responded with movement. It no longer needed to. Everything around me had settled not into stillness, but into presence. I sat on the cushion, not expecting anything, and placed my palms against the stone path beside me. The surface was warm and dry. Beneath it, I thought I felt a subtle rhythm-like heartbeat, like water beneath earth. It didn't quicken or slow with my breath. It simply remained, a companion pulse beneath the weight of the world. The plants around the edge of the clearing had all turned slightly inward, not closed, but curved toward each other, like people listening with their whole bodies. One blossom tilted in my direction, not to be seen, but to see, and then remained there, as if satisfied. I let my eyes close, not sleep, just stillness. Behind my eyelids, the glow of the garden remained not color, not shape, but warmth and quiet in equal parts. When I opened them again, the light had shifted. The stars above were bright, closer somehow, and the moon had risen high enough to paint thin silver across every branch and stone. I noticed then that the ribbon around the old tree's trunk had changed. It was now loosely looped into a bow, the kind tied quickly, without intention to last. I rose and walked back toward it, tracing the same path I had taken earlier. As I reached the tree, the air shifted around minnow wind. No sound, just a pressure change, like the world drawing in breath before a snowfall. I placed my hand against the bark. It was warm again. The knot was loose. I didn't untie it, but the tails of the ribbon brushed gently across my wrist, and I felt something like memory there, not of anything sharp or specific, but of time passed gently, of something being seen and kept. I returned to the arch without looking for a new path. The garden had shown me all it meant to, not through what it displayed, but through what it had allowed me to feel. The ivy remained parted. The moss didn't fade behind me. The petals didn't close. The hush didn't break. And when I stepped through, I carried nothing with minnow token. No flower, no crumb of meaning, only the soft imprint of having been held by a place that did not ask to be understood, only shared. The last time I stepped into the garden, I did not check the sky, or the hour, or the weather. I simply walked, the way one returns to a room they've left only briefly, trusting it would be just as it was, though not unchanged. The ivy over the arch was in bloom again, but this time its petals were smaller, more delicate, like the last blossoms before autumn, clinging with no urgency. I passed beneath them and entered the hush, which met me not with surprise, not with ceremony, but with the kind of quiet only old places offer the quiet of being known. The moss underfoot welcomed the press of my step without shifting. The air was warmer than I remembered, not with heat, but with softness, like the last warmth held in teacups after the room is cooled. Nothing had moved, and yet everything had settled more deeply into itself. The paths were unchanged, but they no longer led, they followed. The garden no longer revealed itself in pieces. It held me entirely, all at once, in every direction. I didn't walk far. I didn't need to. I found the old tree, still standing with its slender arms raised like memory reaching upward. The ribbon around its trunk had come loose and now trailed gently across the grass, undisturbed. I gathered it in my hand and tied it again, not tightly, not to restore it, but to mark the moment the same way one closes a book they plan to reread. I sat at the base of the tree, not on cushion or bench, but simply where the earth felt shaped to hold me. Around me the petals remained open. The low shrubs formed a loose circle, each one blooming quietly, pulsing with that same gentle light I had once mistaken for reflection. There was no sound, but the breath of the leaves, the slow inhale and exhale of green life settling into rest. I could feel the garden at my back, behind the tree, behind the paths, behind the walls, still blooming, still shifting, still offering something more. But I no longer needed to explore it. I no longer felt like a visitor. I was simply someone who had arrived, and arrived again, until the garden had begun to grow around me the way it always had around roots and stone. I closed my eyes and did not count the time. Time here was never about measurement. It was about rhythm, and I had finally learned to move at its pace. When I opened my eyes, the moon had tilted just enough to catch the ribbon and cast a shadow like a path across the ground, a path that did not lead anywhere, only marked where I had been. I stood slowly, brushed earth from my hands, and turned toward the arch. Though the garden did not recede behind me, I carried it with me now, not in thought, not in memory, but in breath. The same rhythm, the same quiet. The ivy parted once more as I passed, just enough to let me through, and the petals, still open, caught the moonlight for a final moment before returning to their steady glow. I stepped beyond the arch and did not look back. The garden would not disappear. It would simply keep blooming, keep waiting, keep resting, forever awake, forever still, and forever just beginning.